And one of the other moments that I will never forget just occurred in this year, Mr. Speaker, when after you were both on the program, I believe, and it was after the governor had presented his budget proposal to a joint house of the House and Senate, and it had been roundly rejected by everyone, including you. And what it forced you to do is go back and really start from absolute zero and look at the state budget. And I remember, as it was yesterday, that you said, paused for a moment and said, this has been an eye-opening experience for me, because as a veteran legislator, both of you, decades in the state Senate and the House, you were learning and finding things out about the state budget that you didn't know were there, didn't have an idea, and that needed to be looked at, and some of these for the very first time. The question, Senator Williams, I'm going to get to that, is should there be a periodic or ongoing examination of the state budget, of programs? It's really sort of a general question about how government works, about avoiding what some had called gridlock at the end of the session in not getting a budget until you went into the special session. Should there be a more regular practice of looking at state government than we've had before?
Well, you first of all have to understand the budget situation. Traditionally, the General Assembly approves about 98 or 99% of the governor's recommended budget. We only change somewhere between 1% and 2% traditionally. It's always been the case. So we were used to, and have always been used to, adopting the largest part of what the governor recommends, because he's the chief magistrate. He's the person who's charged with the responsibility of running the day-to-day operations of government. And so when we were faced with the task of having to build a budget from the ground up with a $1.2 billion budget, that was pretty daunting, believe me. The governor starts his budget deliberations in about the middle of the summer before the session, and the reason I know that is because as Attorney General, I ran a small agency that was subject to that, and we start sending our budget request over, and we get questions back and so on and so forth. So it's about a 6-month process for him with a much larger staff than what we have. Here we were in the second or third week of a general session, and we've got to start from ground zero. You know, I believe that we did a pretty good job with it. It's true we didn't get a budget in the end, primarily because there were different philosophical views between the House and the Senate that hadn't been aired during the interim. I'm convinced, David, that if we had those joint meetings before that session, that we would have understood the Senate's position on certain issues, they would have understood our position on certain issues, and the process would have worked. Now, is that an excuse for not getting a budget? No, we have to take the blame for not doing that. I mean, I understand that, but that's just by way of explanation. Now, we're not going to let that happen again. I mean, I think we both have agreed we want our budget committees to take a deeper look. They always review the government's programs. That's part of their charge during the interim. But now they're going to have to go a step further. And Arnold Simpson, who's in the back, is the Budget Subcommittee Chairman, Tommy Thompson, they're going to have to start really doing what the governor and his agency and his financial people do, and start assuming that we're going to have to build a budget from the ground up and get all that information and get what these agency requests are and what their real needs are in the event that we are confronted with a situation as we had before. Did the governor do anything wrong? The governor's been highly critical of the legislature. The governor met his statutory requirement. He presented us with a balanced budget. That's what the law requires him to do. It was balanced upon legislation that had to be passed that was not likely to pass, and therein became the problem. Is that a true balanced budget? Now, you can argue that all day long semantically, but the point is we shouldn't, as a legislature, nor should any legislatures in the future get caught in that position again. We should assume, because the governor can, and he may well do it. We had no idea that he was going to do what he did. I had no idea he was going to do what he did. I'd read about in the newspapers that it was a possibility and had said publicly that he shouldn't do that, because I don't believe that that particular piece of legislation was so controversial, it had been rejected by the Senate in a special session. Nothing had changed, and I didn't believe it had a chance of passing during that session, so during the budget session. But be that as it may, I think what you're going to see is a whole different way that the General Assembly looks at the budget. And remember, you know, we are part-time legislators. We have our private lives, and we're not there every day, 24, you know, 7 days a week or 5 days a week like the executive employees are. But we're going to have to take more time. We're going to have to be more involved because we can't rely upon the governor, whether he's a Democrat or Republican, to do anything other than what this governor did. It's our responsibility to spend the money. It's what the Constitution charges us to do. That's what our oath of office says we're to do. And my position is that we're going to have to do whatever's necessary to get the information to not be caught in that position again. And I think that we will. I think it was a learning process for us. I learned more as a state legislator about the budget in that session than I learned in all the previous sessions before then, because again, we would take about 98 or 99% of the governor's recommendations and leave them intact. So we had no real reason to get down into all of these sub-issues like Medicaid and prisons. Yes, we take an overview, but now we're going to have to get down to where we, some people would say micromanage. I don't know that it's micromanaging. It's simply fact-finding. We have to have the correct information. We have to have the agency sharing the responsibility of giving us that information. I think we have to be in a position at some point in time to require them to bring us that information. We have the ability during the session to actually subpoena. David and I could issue subpoenas to an agency if we had to. And I had to threaten one cabinet secretary this last session with that before I could get the proper information. And that needs to change. So I think there's going to be a metamorphosis a little bit as far as the budget process goes with how the General Assembly and the executive interact from here on out.
Well, you know, Greg's being very kind to the governor on this situation, and I'm going to be kind to the House on this situation, because the House was presented with a budget that was predicated on money that did not exist and would not exist. There is almost $500 million of slot machine licensing fees that would have taken 5 years worth of licensing fees out into the future that would be pulled back to be spent during this biennium for general fund purposes. Now, even if a slot machine bill had passed the House and Senate, it would have been irresponsible to go out 5 years in advance and bring money and spend the money in this fiscal year. In addition to that, the governor proposed in his budget to take all of the lottery proceeds that we use to pay for key scholarships and drop all that money over into the general fund and bond those scholarships and pay for them, $450 million worth of scholarships to pay for them over the next 20 years. Now that's $900 million, and we have a general fund budget of about $8.4 billion. So that's over $1 billion that he started out. And when you take an organization like the House of Representatives, it's organized in a different sort of way in the Senate. I've been in both of them. And you have all these projects and things and programs that are funded and raises for everybody that are funded, and you present that budget to the House, and there's no way to come up with that money. Nothing good is going to happen. And that was the situation that the Speaker was put into, and I think they did the best they could with it. I've never criticized the Speaker over it. Now, they came up with some business proposals of advancing some tax payments that the Senate did not agree to, and there were some other things that we did not agree to as expenditure levels. But down toward the end of the session, if the governor had intervened in any way, I think the Speaker and I and the chairs of the two committees were close enough with some help from the governor that we could have left there. As a matter of fact, the Senate Conference Committee report that was sent over to the House, Mr. Speaker, is exactly the same budget that the governor came back, that the Senate sent over to the House. It's exactly the budget that the governor came back and introduced in the special session, and we were able to pass in a 5-day period of time. It's not a budget that was particularly tasteful to a lot of people, but it is a fiscally responsible budget that we worked through together. And we do not spend the money. We appropriate the money, and the governor can spend the money we do not have a self-effectuating budget like the federal